And thanks so much for staying with Morning Live. As indicated, we're going to turn our attention now to Zimbabwe. And that's because Zimbabweans are waiting passports are in for a rough time because they'll have to put their travel plans on hold for the time being. And this, of course, because the company in Zimbabwe that prints these passports is actually not going to release these passports until government has cleared its debt. The citizens in the country have been struggling with shortages of cash. We've seen the hikes in fuel and electricity prices, inflation at almost 100%. And Zimbabwe is facing its worst economic crisis in more than a decade. And the economy continues to be under tremendous pressure, affecting services in that country. And last week, there was also the announcement on the new interim currency, the RTGS dollar, the country's sole legal tender, drawing the curtains on a decade of US dollar dominance in Zimbabwe. Dewa Mavinga is the Southern Africa Director with the African Division at Human Rights Watch, and he's here to discuss some of these matters with us. Thanks so much for coming through.
Thank you, and good morning to you, Sakina, and to the viewers at home.
So the situation in Zimbabwe is really, really stark. We were talking not so long ago about a 70% hike in the price of bread. We saw the fuel price hikes. We're talking about basic necessities in the country that are exorbitantly expensive. What are we to make then about the passport situation? Is it just par for the course?
Well, the passport situation is that it is just the tip of the iceberg. Zimbabwe is a nation in huge crisis politically and economically. It's a reflection of the massive mismanagement that is happening now. And it's not just that there are no passports, there is no foreign currency to acquire the needed materials. There is crisis in all sectors. If you go into the shops, the prices are just too high. There are shortages of fuel, and there is further confusion that has been brought in by the banning of a multi-currency system that was dominated by the US dollar. So now it is very difficult to see a clear way forward in terms of resolving the challenges. So what it simply means is that all the efforts now by the government are nowhere near to resolving the crisis, and the passport situation is just a tip of the iceberg.
But we heard President Mnangagwa say that with the issue of the currency, Zimbabwe has now returned to normalcy. And, you know, the normalcy in this instance, speaking to the use of the Zim dollar and, of course, the RTGS. Is there anything normal about that situation?
Well, the situation is far from normal. We have to acknowledge that the Zimbabwe government has a right to make decisions on currency that is in use. But it was not a wise decision because any currency has to have the confidence of the public, and it has to be backed by serious production. But as you mentioned, Sakina, Zimbabwe is most of the day in darkness. There is no electricity. Zimbabwe owes ESCOM, owes its electricity providers, and it has not been paying. And now people are receiving about 4 hours of electricity per day. You can imagine what that means for business. So the government says this is normalcy. The government says Zimbabwe is open for business. But how can a nation be open for business when it has only 4 hours of electricity? 2 nights ago, I flew out of Harare. And the main airport in Harare was in darkness. There was no electricity. They were using phones to light up and, you know, to process the passport. So you can imagine it's utter chaos, but the world is not fully aware of the extent of the challenges.
So, and this is one of those challenges, the electricity situation. And ESCOM, of course, under severe pressure themselves. And yesterday, one of the papers had on their front page this report about Zimbabwe actually paying at least a third of its ESCOM debt. But this is a humiliating situation for Zimbabwe, isn't it? And it questions also the leaders once again with some of the statements that are being issued, especially around the electricity situation.
Absolutely. Well, talk is cheap, but also in this case, there have been untruths that have been told about payments that have allegedly been made, and it turns out those have not been made. And Zimbabwe is failing to service and address its huge debt. Not only that, the country, the leadership, continues to borrow and to live lavishly. they hire private jets to fly all over the world, and yet the country is in dire need of foreign currency, as in dire need of reviving the economy. So there are no hard decisions that are being made to ensure that Zimbabwe is set on a path to recovery economically and politically. What is happening is simply paying lip service to principles of economics. And I would say that the leadership in that regard has completely failed.
Were they lying outright to the citizenry, though?
Well, yes, it turned out it was not true that they had made payments, and but there was now a blame game of saying that the source of the information was maybe the Reserve Bank, and perhaps it was prematurely released, and there was a process that had been initiated. But the reality is that there was no payment that was made, and the reality is that there is no money to make those payments. This RTGS Zimbabwe dollar, there is no public confidence that it would work. So what's happening now is that it fuels the black market, where people are forced to go onto the black market to buy foreign currency, to find ways of continuing to live. But the huge problem, Sakina, in Zimbabwe is what happens to civil servants. So, for example, payments to the police, to the soldiers, to teachers, nurses and doctors, because the currency is worthless. It cannot buy much. 3 pieces of chicken in Zimbabwe cost $40. A box of pizza is about $100. So no one can really afford those things. Basics like bread is going for $7. So the currency is artificial. It's not real. This is why the black market will thrive, and this is why there will be no solution, and companies are closing down every day.
So just finally, President Mnangagwa was supposed to be this great hope. He was supposed to bring relief to the Zimbabwean situation. Where does all of this leave him?
It leaves him in a huge mess, and he needs to make very big decisions now, because we are back into perhaps a situation much more serious than which prevailed when Mugabe was pushed out. So what now is required is serious national dialogue with all stakeholders, and not with just praise singers that are in the so-called Presidential Advisory Council. And ZANU-PF must wake up and realize that to move the nation forward, it cannot be a small party. We need all ideas and all efforts on board to say what needs to be done. And President Mnangagwa has to confront that. Otherwise, this is really a plunge into the abyss.
And just a final question regarding this situation. And you touched on the issue of civil servants not being paid. And we can go through a litany of things that we can mention. But in terms of the human rights situation in Zimbabwe, what is your assessment on that, and what needs to be done?
Well, the assessment is quite bleak, because look, Sakina, access to health. People cannot afford drugs. Hospitals do not have things as basic as painkillers. Doctors do not have access to gloves. Hospitals are not functional anymore. Education, the same applies. Access to food, basic foodstuffs. Millions are starving, and the World Food Program has to feed millions, including in urban areas, which is unheard of. So there is a huge crisis in terms of human rights, and this could trigger, riots that could lead to further abuses, because President Mnangagwa has had a tendency to resort to the army to crush protests without resolving the reasons, the root causes as to why people are going onto the streets to complain about the price for transport, the price for bread, and to complain that life has become intolerable and unbearable. And those that wish to live cannot do so, because passports are now taking at least a year to process, and in fact they are not processing at the moment.
So, and this is why I hone in on that particular matter, because one has to ask the question about the farming situation and, the basic human right to be able to eat, to feed yourself, to have shelter, to have water to drink, and those, level 1 needs that people need to take care of. Again, are people able to do that in Zimbabwe?
The reality is that people are not able to do that. There is a small group of people who are linked to the elites, who are milking and enjoying while the nation is suffering. That small group is living large. There are young ZANU-PF MPs who are buying expensive Lamborghinis on the streets of Harare that cost about 400,000 US dollars. These people are really insulting the generality of Zimbabweans who cannot afford a loaf of bread, who now have to resort to a 1 meal per day just to survive. And the government is failing to service the debts and is not addressing the basics of getting the economy right. Electricity is needed, but 4 hours out of 24 hours, that's not proper, that's not sustainable.
And then coming back finally to that passport situation. So what does this mean for Zimbabweans if you're saying it's taking up to a year to process a passport, and the fact that the company that is tasked with this are saying they will not do any further work until they are paid? What does this mean for people getting in and out of Zimbabwe?
It simply means that the system has collapsed. What needs to happen now is the government must accept defeat and failure and open up for support. It also means that most likely these new measures of a new currency are not working. So it's now, that's the evidence of failure that has been presented and that needs to be acknowledged and accepted, because people are suffering and they cannot move. There are people with emergency situations. So not even an emergency passport can be processed. So that's a huge challenge. There must be other options that need to be explored. For example, the use of the rand as currency to negotiate with South Africa. But perhaps there is reluctance from the leadership to go that way because they will not control the rand, the printing of the rand. Because now this RTGS fake currency, the quasi-currency that's there, they can print as they wish to fund their own lavish lifestyles, but the people will be suffering. Emergency situations are not attended to. So if only the leadership can put the interests of all the people first and say, what are the best interests of our people to advance the nation? Let us do those things that need to be done, not for the benefit of the leadership, but for the benefit of all the people. That is what freedom is about. That is what, the liberation struggle was about, but it's not happening.
Is there anything that the citizens can do about the situation?
Well, the citizens need to speak out and also to mobilize, because they should be, and to demand a national dialogue, to demand that the leadership confronts the reality of the failing of the system. But not only citizens generally, but also the civil servants. The police, the soldiers, the doctors, the nurses must also, through their structures and unions, speak out and force the government to do the right things.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dewa Mavinga, Southern Africa Director with the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, on the state of the Zimbabwean economy and, of course, what this means for the citizens in that country. Dire situation playing out there. And we will, of course, keep our eye on the developments.